Welcome to Dusty Little Wastelanders, Chapter 13, Reunion. I was accompanied by a small gathering of folks while we marched to save the manor. Well, they marched to save the manor. I marched to save Kyle. The Dustnado had left so much evidence of its existence. My group and I were stepping over shanty walls that crowded the path. Personal belongings were strung throughout the entirety of Hillville. Clothes were hung up on scraps that had blown up against other shanties. Family portraits littered the floor with shattered frames. Any book that had met the Rager's path was blown to pages. We kept our way, headed for the manor. My boots crunched on shattered glass. My legs navigated around the shanty walls that strung throughout the town. My nose filled with that burning scent. Some citizens were running around, trying to gather their blown-away belongings. At least, I assumed it was their belongings. All sorts of thieves tended to surface in the wake of a Dustnado. I could count on one hand the amount of shanties that still stood. 3. They'd all been spared by some stroke of luck. We made it to the former gate of McDougal's manor. The Dustnado had left the door open for us. Maneuvering this close to the heart of the storm wasn't smart or easy. The folks I walked with got knocked on their asses. Some tumbled back one way, while others were sucked into the fire by the vacuum current. They were all unmasked fools who died from dust consumption regardless. It might take its time, but it always got its victims. In some instances, like Mom and Daddy, it was a more immediate death, but those only resulted in extreme consumption. My heels dug into the dirt, moving 1 foot at a time and riding the wind, although riding wind this strong was more like riding a bull. It was aiming to knock me on my ass. I was the only one in my makeshift posse that made it through the blown-apart gates. Everyone else was either blown or sucked one way or the other. Amid this chaos, I kept my focus. A multitude of greenery flew past my face at all times. At least I'd managed to avoid shanty walls and personal belongings. For once, I was relieved by McDougal's seclusion. The bottom floor of the mansion was a complete blaze, but the slave station remained unburnt. Of course, the slave station wasn't heated and didn't have windows. It was practically a Dustnado shelter. I fought my way to the right. The wind beat down on me and the dust covered my body. A tree branch tore loose from its home and struck me with a vicious sting. Some trees had been smacked hard enough by the wild wind current to burst right in half. I'd never seen a current that strong. Something like that had reduced me to ground beef, and there was no predicting or dodging in any current. I had to shove that thought right out my ear. I kept my way towards the slave quarters, a single step at a time. Never before has such a short distance felt so vast. The blind noise of the storm suffocated any sounds from the air, probably for the best. I'd rather hear the storm than the shrieks of burn victims. Smoke was added to the list of things that I had to worry about consuming in excess. The bandana was good enough for dust, but I didn't know how well it would fare against smoke. The storm raged on and the wind rammed a log right into my chest. I crashed to my ass and tumbled through the gravel. Every cut on my glass-shredded skin cried out for mercy. My limbs flailed blindly in a cloud of black dust. It was as though Miss Nature herself had decided to add a cup of dust to this recipe. The blackness closed in and my hands disappeared, and my goal was no longer in sight. The winds continued to get angry. I went from the occasional branch slap to a straight-up ambush. Trying to regain my footing among the vicious wind and branch bombardment was a chore, but I made it. With my footing regained, I waited for a break in the gust and committed back in the movement. A good-sized rock clocked me in the forehead and knocked me right onto my back. The fall took my breath away, and I just lay there. Getting up was too much work. My body and my face were blood-covered. I felt like jerky just before swallowing. No more walking, my feet demanded. I turned on my stomach and pressed up onto my knees. They'd always taught me to stay low. Perhaps it was safer to travel on one's knees as well. Either way, getting vertical in the eye of the Rager had proven painful enough by this point. I crawled through the storm, like a peasant begging for rations. It was hard to keep my eyes off the manor. The storm was tearing it up and dumping dust through every crevice while the flames climbed the floors. My mind needed to stay single-focused, but it was too glorious to resist. Another loose branch slapped me back into focus. This one whipped right against my face. It stung like hell and formed another gash. It was clear that even when lying down, I couldn't hide from the branch barrage. I conceded to keep my focus on the slave station. The slave station was blurring back into focus. Either the storm was dying down, or I was finally getting close enough to my goal. I was hoping for the latter. The storm was stuck in time. Dustnados are constantly moving, although in the heat of the storm, they seemed as though they were just parked right here. I had to have been fighting through this manor for close to an hour now. The Rager should have passed through in half the time. My knees and elbows were beat all to shit. Crawling through the gravel would do that. Every inch ached at this point. So did my face after every branch slap, and my head split from squinting through these goggles so long. I made myself see the aches and pains as trivial. They were nothing compared to what Kyle had been through. I abandoned him for close to a month. That was unforgivable. My brother had been bagged, chained, sold, and forced into labor, and I had the nerve to complain about some aches and pains. Not anymore. This storm had no power over me. I was fueled by my brother's trials. I crumbled to the floor. I'd been shot, my legs thrashed, and my hand clenched at the point of contact. It was dry. No bleeding was a good sign. My rapid breathing had to be tamed through gritted teeth. I lay there for a moment to allow the shooting pain to diminish. Miss Nature had probably just thrown another rock my way. Navigating this storm was challenging enough. I propped back up on my aching knees and elbows. The crawl had to continue, and I had to block out these mundane aches and pains. The slave station door felt as though it was just a finger's length away. It was too close to be denied now. I wouldn't allow it. I felt it, a vacuum current, and it was here to pull me away from my goal. And judging by its general direction, I guess it aimed to add me in the pile of charred bodies in that fire. My muscles clenched to resist the pull. I tensed up. I did all the things, but there was no traction to be had in the middle of this gravel path. Try as I might, I was coming with that vacuum current, period. My knees curled and I sprang off to my toes, my arms outstretched for that gold doorknob. My quick efforts and gangly limbs came in handy. The distance between the knob and me was eliminated. Despite having a hold on the doorknob, the vacuum continued to suck. It was persistent and continued to pull. Damn determined to reduce me to kindling, but I was damn determined to resist. Whose determination was stronger, Miss Nature or my own? I knew it was Miss Nature, but I was hoping she'd give me this one. I deserved it, damn it. My hands clung to the knob as if they were Kyle's hands, the vacuum a manifestation of the people who tried to pull us apart. But I had a hold of Kyle this time, and I wasn't letting go. Miss Nature conceded, the vacuum current ceased. She did make sure to toss another branch in my face. It burned from being caught on fire, but the burns were something I could endure. Just a different kind of scar on my marred face. The current was gone, and my grip around the knob remained true. It was time to break into this slave station. I twisted and yanked the knob, but the door did not budge. It wasn't locked. Damn wind! It was stuck. My goal was within grasp, but until the wind lightened up, I wouldn't be able to budge this door. Its hinges were mounted to swing my way, so although kicking the door would feel incredible, it wouldn't serve any productive purpose. But anger management seemed pretty productive at this time, so I kicked the hell out that door. Maybe someone on the other end would take it as knocking and would answer. Doubt the slaves had freedom enough to do even that. I was stuck on this door until further notice. I turned back to the mansion. The fire had spread to the second floor. The storm had moved to the back half of the manor. Just a few more minutes and I'd be out of the eye. Wind currents were less intense the further the storm got away. And technically, the storm was losing force from the moment of its conception, right off the bat. That's how they worked. They'd rage until they were all out. I'd bet I'd be in the clear by the time the storm reached TJ's collection of shanties. Hopefully TJ had gotten the hell out of there by now. Dustnadoes knew no mercy and wrecked shanties like a pig slop. My mind navigated back to the people at the bar. I was really only worried about K2. I hoped I got to him in time. It was wild to think that Esther had been my old kindergarten teacher this whole time. Probably never figure it out without hints. Kyle would be thrilled to see Mr. Williams again. Not just Mr. Williams, but our whole posse. I wonder what he was thinking when he thought of Donald and TM. In a few minutes, I'd ask him. Just a few more minutes. We'd been separated for I didn't know how long. Too long. Should I do the right thing and wait for a couple more minutes? Or should I let go of this doorknob and look for another way in? I already knew there weren't any windows, but what about another door? There my mind went again, forming new plans when it wasn't necessary to do so. Should have paid more attention to this building when I had the chance. I closed my eyes. The storm's wind flooded my mind. Just wait, a woman called out to me. Who? I could not identify, but I listened. I'd say it was Mom if I had to guess. Several minutes had never passed so slow. My hands were numb for keeping such a tight hold on this doorknob. I tried not to watch the storm. Watching the storm wasn't any good way to pass the time. My mind slipped into wondrous thoughts of my time with Kyle after these trials. We'd have to go get red apples. Kyle loved red apples. Then maybe TM, Kyle, and I could stargaze a couple of nights. We'd definitely have to go sleeping bag shopping. I was sure Donald was dying to show off Monica to Kyle. And of course, Esther and K2 would have to be all over the fun too. Boy, how our posse has grown. A rush of branches pummeled me silly. Miss Nature was telling me to wake up and focus. There was no sense in daydreaming about my time with Kyle anymore. Kyle was one doorway away from me. One doorway away from turning my daydreams into reality. I gave the door a tug and was knocked onto my back. I wasn't expecting it, but the door had opened. It blew open with a force that knocked me on my ass, but I now forced a way in. I scrambled into the shelter and slammed the door behind me. I stood to face forward. This place plastered the makeup.
Hey there, what's up? LL Smith here. Thank you so much for enjoying my audiobook. I'm going to interrupt you real quick and say, if you get real anxious to hear what happens next and just can't wait till next week, or if you get the urge to just support such a stunning, ruggedly handsome, and awesome independent creator such as myself, I encourage you highly to go follow the link in the description and support the official release. Thank you so much for listening, and let's jump right back into that story.
I knew he was working hard for another tip. Given the looks he'd given my dirty hair the last time, I'd assumed his jaw would have just about fallen out of sight. He put his arm around Kyle, who flinched again. The barber pulled away and opted to guide Kyle to his trim station. "So what are we looking to do with your hair?" the barber asked. "I want it all gone." Kyle asserted with an alarming firmness. Hearing his cut choice choked my throat. To think that he'd be rid of all of Mom's golden locks just about brought me to tears. Given the state of his patchy hair, I couldn't argue with the logic of starting fresh. But was this a fresh start or a refresh? Would he grow his hair out again or keep it shaved? Would he hide his blonde hair under a hat like I did? Or was I overthinking this whole thing? Was it just a haircut for Kyle? That was what I wanted to fall back on, but the tone of his voice hinted otherwise. Another person walked in from the outside. I looked over my shoulder and caught a glimpse of one of the old hens from the last time. I knew her face at first glance. I turned back, unaware of whether I'd been detected. The lady walked back into my view and found a seat beside the other gentleman who'd walked in after Kyle and me. It didn't take long for the two of them to spark up a conversation. I tried not to listen, but the lady gossiped loud enough to wake TM. "McDougal," she mouthed a single phrase, and my eyes were honed. "Yeah," the man beside her said. "He let most of us go after the fire. Hard to employ butlers and maids with no building to look after." "I hear he stays up in the old slave quarters," the lady commented with a shiver. "Yeah," the man confirmed. "Since the slaves escaped, he's been cooped up in there." "Such a shame," the lady shook her head. "A mind as brilliant as his wasting away in a slave's quarters." "I'm sorry," another voice refocused my attention. "What's the matter?" the barber asked. "I haven't begun cutting yet." I looked back over to the barber. Kyle was staring in the reflective glass, tears soaking his cheeks, silent whimpers from his mouth, and constant sniffles scrunching his nose. I couldn't get from my seat and over to his side fast enough. I watched him crumble out of the chair, spill onto the floor, find his knees only to curl into the fetal position. I made it over to Kyle just as the fetal position had been completed. "I'd cry too if my hair looked like that," the hen fussed with a shaken head. "Kyle," I dropped to his side. He shivered with vicious tears. I didn't know where to start. "I swear, sir," the barber said, "I didn't do anything." I reached out for Kyle's quivering shoulder. He flinched away from me and retreated further into himself. He'd never pulled away from me in the past. What could have spooked him so savage? I was starting to realize that these outbursts might be a reoccurring problem. "I'm here now, Kyle," I said, reaching out slower this time. "It's Enry." My hand continued to creep toward him. My cold, coarse hand finally landed on Kyle's shoulder. He didn't flinch or pull away. He did continue to shiver and sob. "Hey, bud," I called out. "You're good now. No one's gonna get you." I placed my other hand on his opposite shoulder. The shivers ceased and I pulled him back onto his knees. His blushing, washed-out face focused on the floor. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked. He shook his head no. I looked back up to the barber who watched this, teary-eyed himself. "Do you have any idea what started this?" I asked. "Not really," the barber answered. "He sat up in my chair and froze from there. He became unresponsive almost immediately, and then crumbled into a sobbing mess shortly thereafter." I tried to be Kyle after stabilizing Kyle's still crying self. I took a seat in the barber's chair. "Is this going to take long?" the hen called out to the barber. "Hush up, you old hen," I hollered back. "You can get your wig hacked when it's your turn." "I do not have to put up with this." The woman stood from her chair and scoffed out the door. "Sir," the barber started, "I can't have you running off customers." "I'll pay for her cut. Just let this happen," I said. "We need this." The barber looked back down at Kyle. He could see that whatever this was clearly needed. I studied my reflection. It had changed yet again. I could now make out my full facial destruction from the storm. My nose sat crooked and swollen on my face. I'd noticed it was tender to the touch, too, so it was broken for sure. That was the biggest eyesore, but my face was also cracked full of glass and other lacerations. Most stayed red from dried up blood, while a few spewed fresh liquid. My lips were puffy in places where more blood had congealed, and I had a palm-sized burn on my left cheek from being smacked by that branch. I hadn't warned Betty in the storm, but I still discovered a new hole in her brim. I stuck my finger through it to gauge the size. I looked back down at Kyle. He still wept on the ground. I looked back up at my reflection. I started adding up all the discoveries I just made about myself when looking in that glass. I wondered what discoveries Kyle had made when he was seeing himself. This was probably his first reflection since having been saved. Experiencing it was bad, no doubt, but seeing it would have certainly served as a reminder of those experiences. "Can I get you to get rid of the reflective glass?" I asked of the barber. "Shaving and bald should be an easy enough cut, so I shouldn't need the reflection." "No," Kyle spoke. I looked down to Kyle, who still quivered on his knees. "I will face this." Kyle spoke again, more stern than I think I'd ever heard. He worked back up to his feet and turned to face me in the chair. His face was new. I stood from the chair and took the hint. I grabbed the waiting chair and pulled it up closer to Kyle while the haircut started. I watched Kyle's eyes. He burned holes into his reflection. He watched the hair fall with a focused passion. His eyes were fierce. They weren't Mom's eyes. They were fierce like mine, or Daddy's. I realized it fully now. New Kyle had probably been in utero since the kidnapping, and I just witnessed the death of old Kyle and the birth of new Kyle. For the first time since he'd reached for my firing pistol, I felt uncomfortable in Kyle's presence. This was new Kyle. He was uncomfortable around me for the first time when he flinched away from me. That was also new Kyle. My dreams of a refresh were out of reach, and I had to settle with this new start. Kyle's bright hair fell a clump at a time. He watched it with a new focus, while I watched him with a new concern. The balding head took what felt like seconds. Soon, both Kyle and I had fixed eyes on his bald, dirty, and scraggly scalp. Kyle stood from the chair and dusted stray hair from his clothes. Kyle approached me with a hand gesture to suggest it was my turn. I took the suggestion and found a seat in the barber's chair. The cushion was still warm. I removed Betty from my hat and sat her in my lap. "Just a light trim," I instructed. "Just enough to get it out of my eyes." I turned my eyes to Kyle while my hair was being reshaped. At first glance, it appeared as though he was glaring straight at me. But once I met his stare, it became apparent that he was staring right through me. I followed his stare to the opposite side of the room. The barber probably hated keeping up with my head movements. I searched the seemingly plain wall for anything worthy of new Kyle's attention. There was an old painting hung on the wall. It had to be what caught new Kyle's eye. I studied the dated portrait and tried to place the face. It took several squinted minutes for my eyes and brain to communicate. They finally found a match. That was a portrait of Richard McDougal. Judging by the inaccuracies, it was either painted by a biased artist or was dated by at least a decade. Mr. McDougal was a stout figure in this portrait, sporting the figure of a circus strongman. His brown hair was void of any gray, and his mustache thicker than usual. He also sported a common working man's overalls and cloth. The irritation crept up my neck. I wanted to spend the day with my brother. Instead, his focus was held on this portrait of Richard McDougal. And now here I was, studying the dang thing too. "How does it look?" The barber broke my daydream. I turned back to the reflection glass. For what it was worth, I was staring back at the best haircut I'd seen since ever, I reckon. My brown hair dangled just above my ears. It'd be out of my eyes for a couple months. I flipped Betty back over and reached in for my wallet. My hand was stopped by the barber's disapproving glare. "Don't worry about it," he said. It doesn't feel right." "But," I started. "That old hen, as you called her, she'll be back," the barber assured me. "Okay," I said. "Well, thank you." Kyle was out of his seat in time with me, and we were taking our leave from the barber shop. Kyle's eyes remained focused the entire way back to the bar. I tried to find something to talk about, but my mind was empty. We kicked up dust all the way back to Esther's and didn't say a word. We walked around to the back of Esther's bar and walked in on a cleaning frenzy. TM, Esther, and K2 tried not to stare at Kyle's drastic change. I wonder if they only saw a bald head or if they saw his focused eyes, too. "You all been busy," I broke the ice. "I want to open up in 2 days," Esther announced. "Reopen in only 3 days after a dustnado is a lofty goal." "Lofty, but not impossible," Esther corrected. "Well, I reckon it's never too soon for Kyle to start earning his keep," I announced with a grin. All the eyes bounced from my blasphemous statement. All but Kyle's. His just maintained a beady stare. "Come on, K2, I called out to K2 with a wave. "We're going to get a front door for this bar. I'm tired of walking around." "Couldn't you just remove the boards?" Esther proposed. "Either way, you'll still need a door, and we want to get you one." I turned to my company. K2 grinned wide and genuine, but new Kyle faked a pathetic smile. I turned and led my posse back to the bar. We spilled back into the street and worked our way back up the street and toward Joey's woodworking. I'd chosen this task for a purpose. Old Kyle loved company and befriended everyone. If new Kyle made no effort to win over K2, then I could assume that new Kyle was old Kyle's opposite, which at least would be easier to deal with than something more complicated. We had made it halfway through our journey and the silence persisted. We approached McDougal's derelict manor. I saw Kyle shiver. He was still haunted by his experiences. Even his new self was affected by his memories. I'd assumed the mood swing was brought on as a self-defense mechanism, but it now seemed more involuntary. We made it to Joey's woodworking. The shanty it had been kept under had been gone with the wind, but Joey kept most of his tools and supplies well secured. The idea was to prevent thievery, but instead he prevented a raging duster from sending his shop through the skies like tools of great malice. We had to find a wood slab about the size of Esther's opening, sand it down, and then attach the swingers to it. K2 darted straight for the slabs. I raced to keep up with him, and Kyle stuck close to me. "This is our door," K2 called out, reaching out for a slab hanging just above his head. "How do you figure?" I asked. "It measures from my shoulder to my wrist, which is roughly how long the opening at the bar is," K2 explained. "Well, at least one of us made an effort to measure," I said. Joey met us by the slab with a step stool and some sheets of sandpaper. He helped us get the slab down and set up for sanding. After he felt we were ready for work, Joey wandered off to help other customers. We divvied up our efforts, each person on a corner. I took the top right, Kyle on the left, and K2 got the bottom corners. Our palms rubbed away against the rough wood grain. This labor was more therapeutic than taking deep breaths with closed eyes. I could imagine I was rubbing McDougal's face down to the bone. It felt great. I imagined what Kyle was making of this exercise. Was he rubbing away the flesh of one of his tormentors? K2 struggled with this task. He wiped too softly and slipped off the edge of the slab more often than not. I guess he wasn't as tormented as either of us. "Hey, K2, Kyle asked. "Yes, K1, K2 shot back. Do you know why this door didn't laugh at my joke? Kyle asked. No. K2 scratched his head, assuming he'd missed the joke. Because I didn't knock first. Kyle gave his knee a slap. That awful humor was coming straight from the old Kyle. I think I laughed for the first time at one of Kyle's jokes. Albeit a very brief, grin-filled chuckle, that was old Kyle. And so now I had to deal with inconsistent mood shifts. He'd walked in new Kyle, but was now interacting as old Kyle. Trying to understand these mood swings made me feel as though Betty had a vice grip around my head. I tried to turn off my thinking and just enjoy the moment. Maybe the labor had been good for Kyle. Knock knock, K2 said. Who's there? Kyle answered with a smile. Cow says, K2 answered. Cow says who? Kyle answered. No, Cow says moo, K2 punchlined. They fell out in a fit of belly laughs, and I was now the only one scraping the wood slab. I enjoyed their interaction, so I held off from intervening. It was nice to finally see old Kyle getting along with K2. I knew they could be buds. Kyle's circumstances were just throwing up potholes, and K2 was my friend, the only member of our posse that I'd welcomed in. I needed satisfaction to seeing them two getting along. Okay, you two, I soiled the fun. I didn't come here to exchange bad jokes. Get to sanding. Oh, don't be such a sour apple, Kyle frowned. Yeah, K2 chimed in. Why don't you tell a joke? Enry doesn't tell jokes, Kyle insisted. That's not true, I defended. I'm just too focused on not joking. Come on, Enry, K2 begged. Yeah, Enry, Kyle double-teamed. Shit. I had to come up with a joke now. Them squirts were harping me from both angles, and I couldn't let that happen. But I didn't have any jokes. I never sat around thinking of jokes. Who does that? Was that what Kyle did? Was that how he always had these terrible jokes at the ready? I bet this door is really open to trying new things, I proudly exclaimed. They gave me bored stares. That was lame, Enry. Kyle rolled his eyes. Yeah, K2 added. I'd rather just listen to paper scraping the rest of the day. Well, at least then we'd be getting some work done, I fussed. That was funny. How could they roll with laughter at their lame jokes but stare stone-faced at my equally lame joke? We shaved on with infrequent jokes. After close to an hour of shaving, we flipped the slab and sanded the other side. After another near hour of wood smoothing, it was time to tack on the swingers. We fastened them so that the door could swing forward when pushed from the outside. It was ideal for customer entry. We paid Joey $33 for the door, and I lugged it through the trails back to the bar. I hefted the front half of the solid slab, and K2 took up the rear. We let Kyle lead the venture. He offered to help carry the door, but I was too concerned for his physical well-being. We pressed on with our backs to McDougal's Manor, and all our spirits seemed high. We were back in front of Esther's bar after a short journey, and he'd already pried the boards from the entryway. TM was waiting for us on the porch. He sprang up like a rodent upon spotting us. He ran up to Kyle and snagged his hand. We still had old Kyle with us, so I didn't think too much on TM's interaction. K2 and I hung our door up while Kyle and TM kept us level. Esther brought us all some water, and we sat on the porch, drinking, discussing recent events, and taking in the night. TM and Kyle were stargazing from the porch. It was a new location, but the same old stargazing. K2 and Esther yacked on about stuff that had happened before I got here. I kept my focus on the door that represented our success of the day. A day thick with trials. I'd walked into this day wanting a refresh for Kyle and me. I was now sitting at the edge of this day, wrapping my head around what had become our new norm. End of chapter 15.